am Carolyn Schubert, and with me is Margie Nidecker, and we are the faculty of Nursing Practice 8480, which is quality improvement for the DNP. Our guest today, and we're very honored to have her, is Dr. Mary Burkett. Dr. Burkett has a long history in quality improvement. She's currently on the faculty of Capital University and is a recent graduate, in fact, within the last couple of weeks, of our DNP program here at The Ohio State University. She previously was a Senior Vice President of Quality and Clinical Outcomes of Select Medical Corporation, where she was responsible for the quality of clinical programs in over 90 long-term acute care hospitals and also accountable for their clinical and regulatory compliance. Prior to that, she was CEO of Select Specialty Hospital of Columbus. She has many years of critical care nursing and management experience and received both her master's degree and her DNP from The Ohio State University. Welcome, Dr. Burkett.
Thank you.
Dr. Burkett, as far as quality improvement experiences, describe your background and experience. We've kind of just generally reviewed your positions, but can you tell us how you would explain just the life that you've had in quality improvement professionally?
Well, having 40 years as a nurse, I can trace back the quality movement throughout my career. So my first management position would have been in 1975 or 6, and quality was really just getting started as a regulatory issue for Joint Commission and also for CMS. So that is the audit period of quality. And unfortunately, we are to some extent still in the audit period of quality, which I would like to just parenthetically add is kind of a waste of time. But so that was my beginning. As a clinical nurse specialist, I was a clinical nurse specialist for a number of years in critical care, and I was involved in the quality committees and quality improvement initiatives. In the 80s, when CQI and Deming and the continuous quality improvement movement began, like many managers, I received education and training in that. But and a lot of that was put into use, but we still kept recycling that sort of old mentality audit process for quality. We fast forward to when I really had some degree of say in how that would happen, which would have been as the Chief Nursing Officer and in charge of quality outcomes for Select Medical. We really moved away from the auditing process and into continuous quality improvement, evidence-based practice initiatives, and really trying to look at the robust data that exists in all hospitals and deal with where your issues are, what are your opportunities, what are your issues. So I guess I would say I'm pretty proud of that, because we no longer have rooms full of audits that nobody's doing things with. We actually have projects that you can look at and track the start, the beginning, and the end of the project, and you can actually see the results in the data that really, for the most part, is already being collected by institutions.
So really what I guess the whole point of quality improvement, as you said, first of all, it's gone through an evolution. It's you've seen the changes over the years that you've been involved, and it is a specialty that you have developed and learned. And you mentioned that you were a CNS, and how did you include or connect with the nurses and explain the importance of quality improvement to them? And how did you find the reactions of the nursing staff? And was there buy-in? Was there resistance? Because again, as a CNS and a quality improvement champion, you had to have that collaboration. So can you talk a little bit about just how you explained that to them?
Well, first of all, I think that nurses intrinsically care about quality. So I think it's not that difficult to engage them in quality discussions and quality initiatives. Now, when I was a CNS, that certainly precedes even the Deming CQI. I mean, this would have been in the 70s, early 80s. But nonetheless, I think nurses really, like I said, professionally, we care about doing quality patient care. So, to engage a nurse into what can we do better, what are our problems, what do we need to fix, how do we fix them, what kind of education, what kind of support, I think is something that is part of what goes well with a nurse to begin with. I think when it doesn't go well is when leadership imposes quality initiatives from on high without engaging them from the beginning. So I believe that nurses need to be engaged beginning, middle, and the dissemination phase. They should feel proud of what they've done. And if we fail to do that, that's when I think nurses will turn off. But they're not turning off from quality, they're turning off from their leaders.
That's a beautiful segue into my next question, because you recently attained your DNP degree. The students that are watching this video are pursuing that same degree. And if you talk about the participation of nurses, not leaving behind the quality piece, certainly, being committed to that, but not being committed to the organizational mission or dictates that are being handed down. So how do you see your role as a DNP in that process, or in alleviating that disconnect between nurses and organizational structure?
Well, I think that the DNP should be the evidence-based practice mentor. They ideally should be very competent in that role. And as such, it's great and fun to engage nurses in just the beginning, the spirit of inquiry, and examining their day from beginning to end under the lens of inquiry is kind of a fun thing to do. And when you can introduce evidence and make a change that's significant for nurses and patients, that's fun. That's fun for the staff, that's fun for the DNP. And so I think that really is the way to do it. I really look at this as being, leadership has a crucial role in promoting quality and evidence-based practice. But at the end of the day, it's done at the bedside by the caregivers, and those folks have got to be engaged, and they will be engaged, especially when you have the catalyst as the DNP to be the person that can get it going. But I think it starts with the spirit of inquiry. I'm very ingrained in the Melnick Feingold overhaul process of evidence-based practice. It works. I believe in it, and I'm teaching it now. I see the students' light bulbs go on all the time when we talk about it. So I think it's a natural fit for nurses.
Absolutely. In your practice, because we've kind of covered the theory of quality improvement, in your practice when you're designing a project, what has been most helpful to you in starting that project, designing it, gathering the data, going through the steps of actually conducting a QI project?
Well, I think you have to decide what you want to deal with first, and so there are some sources for that. So I think that the Iowa model does give you a sort of a good appreciation of either a knowledge focus or a problem focus. Knowledge is there's new knowledge that we need to implement, and it would be a good thing for us to do that. Or looking at a problem focused trigger, i.e. we've got a problem with hospital-acquired wounds, or we've got a problem with catheter-associated bloodstream infections, or whatever those problems are. And every organization has robust internal data upon which to analyze and look at and figure out what are our opportunities. So I think it can start with either of those two triggers. I believe that then it's a matter of getting into the evidence and figuring out, what's the right thing, the best thing, what does the evidence say. And I think a change model is critical. I'm a real advocate of the Cotter change model. And I really, my advice to DNPs about that, if any change model really, but just remember that when you're managing that change, you've got to manage the people up, the leadership in the organization, and you've got to manage down the people that are actually implementing the change. If you forget to manage either one of those, it's a critical mistake. You know, I lovingly call them the bean counters. The bean counters can put a stop to things if they think it's spending money without, they don't understand why you're spending money. So there's a lot of things to think about. So I like to put a change model into the process because I think it allows you to avoid the pitfalls, because all quality at the end of the day is going to result in a change.
So have you ever had any projects where you have collected data and realized that that was not the data that you wanted or needed? Or have you ever had projects where you were going through them and suddenly realized that this was not a doable project, or it wasn't? Byrne talks a lot about the so what factor in her EVP discussions, and just decided that there was not the weight or importance of conducting that QI project.
I would say that I don't think I can recall conducting a project that didn't have a so what factor to it. But there are projects that in my patient population there was a need to do something about, but there isn't data about it. So then you're stuck with, what do you do? So I think that, and I'll just give an example. We took care of the chronically critically ill. So a lot of those patients, probably about 50% of them, came with PEG tubes. And taking care of a PEG tube over a prolonged period of time can be a challenge, and dislodgements can be catastrophic. So we were looking at how to prevent PEG tube dislodgements. There is literally nothing in the evidence about that. So then what we decided to do, because you can't give up on that, it's still an issue, is we decided to look at our internal data and do some analysis of that. And what we found is that there were 3 major occasions where patients were likely to dislodge a tube. One is that restless patient who was taken out of restraints in the last 48 hours. That would be an issue. A second issue was the obese patient, because there's not a good way to tack it down. And the third issue was the staff just getting the patient out of beds, just not careful. So what we did was look at all 3 of those issues. We got a special securement device for the obese patients. We did a mobility timeout where staff would say, timeout, are all the tubes and lines secure? And we played hide the tube on the patient and there was ways to do that, but for the patient that had just been removed from restraint. So one of the things, we would usually convert them to intermittent feeding and just tuck the tube under a binder and just use an intermittent feeding to protect the tube. And that dramatically reduced the number of dislodgements, but that wasn't based on external evidence. So I guess there's a lot of ways to deal with a quality issue, but once you've identified it, you really need to do something about it.
That's a great example of looking at the internal data, interpreting it, and then making a process change. Are there other examples of barriers, or I guess looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the projects that you've done, in terms of what's facilitated them, what has posed to you, barriers and
Well, there's always barriers. So, if, for example, you want to implement something to improve the ease of mobility for an obese patient, but it costs an extra $225, that's a barrier. So then you've got to look at, how do you justify that cost over, 3,000 patients in bed per day? Not all of them would qualify as obese, but at least 30% would be classified as obese. So when you do something like that, you look at movement injuries in nurses. And when you can demonstrate that your movement injuries go to almost zero by implementing something that costs $225, that becomes a no-brainer even for the CFO of the company. So I just think that there's a lot of strategy sometimes in getting a quality project up and going. There are physicians will resist. You want to do something different. We had a lot of our patients came with trachs, and trach tube dislodgement can be absolutely catastrophic. So when you look at developing a protocol to prevent trach dislodgement, that requires physician buy-in, and you can just magnify that by doing that in 110 hospitals with 110 groups of pulmonologists that all have to agree. So that becomes some logistical issues, but at the end of the day, we figure out a way to do it.
So when you talk about these projects, who and how would you select those that would be helping you on your team? Because no one person can do these types of projects and conduct them to the finish line.
We had a really nice structure where I was. So we had what originally was called a data cave, and it really was a data cave because once it went in, nobody knew what was there and nobody was mining the data. But once that data became exposed to the light of day, that was highly useful. And so we had an IT team that was partnering with clinical to really help us get at the data. And that was just so pivotal, I think, in improving quality and the efficiency of doing a quality project. So that was one thing. But we had a team of people. So each group of hospitals had a clinical person and a quality person assigned to them, and then they were in charge of a group of hospitals. So it was from a standpoint of having a group of people who were invested in quality that was already there by structure, and then certainly existed within the hospitals themselves.
That's great. I think Margie is going to shift gears a little bit and ask you about your project.
Okay.
So you're a quality leader and champion, years of experience in that arena, and you have just completed your DNP and your DNP project. So I think for this audience here, for our students watching the videos, many of them are just starting their DNP project, and some might still be selecting their DNP project or topic. So I'd like to get some lessons learned from you. So maybe you could start by telling us what project you selected, the topic, and how you carried that out.
Okay. Can I just give a little bit of advice so I don't forget it?
Yes,
First,
please
okay.
do.
So my first advice is pick an evidence-based practice project. Don't get stuck in some type of little mini research project or little mini epidemiological project or some kind of a data mining project. The role of the DNP is to be expert at evidence-based practice, and that is going to be a vitally useful tool to the institutions where they're going to be employed. And failing to execute evidence-based practice when you have the opportunity, especially being mentored by your professors, I think is a loss. And so I'm just saying my first advice is do an evidence-based practice project. And that's, at the moment, still a little bit of an option. I think that there's some confusion about what the role of the DNP is. So the DNP is not a PhD light degree. It is somebody who's expert at evidence-based practice. And so the project really needs to be evidence-based practice. So I digress. My project was dealing with prevention of hospital-acquired wounds in the intensive care unit patients. And it started, the spirit of inquiry, because I think all evidence-based practice projects start with the spirit of inquiry, started when I was visiting one of our hospitals, and heard a page overhead that said tap to the right. And I didn't really even ask about it at the time until I heard a couple hours later tap to the left. And I thought, what? So I asked the CNO, and she goes, oh, that's what we do to make sure that everybody's getting turned in position. It's turn in position. So I said, oh, okay. So the next 2 hours was tap to the back, and I stood in the hallway and nobody did anything. And I thought, this is so typical where we fix things, but we don't really fix things. And policies actually rarely fix things. So that started me to wonder, first of all, was the 2-hour turning interval even evidence-based? As it turns out, it's not. Are there other ways to trigger a turn? As it turns out, there are. And what are the best strategies to prevent hospital-acquired pressure ulcers? So that's how my journey started, and that's what I chose to do for my DNP project. So what we did was implement event-based therapeutic repositioning in the ICU. Event-based means instead of I turn an 8-10-2, which doesn't get done, and there's robust research that says it doesn't get done. It gets done about 20 to 30% of the time, and that's what our little project validated as well. 34% of the time, patients got turned appropriately in that by-the-clock strategy. But if the trigger becomes regular, predictable nurse-patient interactions, end-of-shift report, the 10 o'clock med pass, the meal, the 2 o'clock assessment, the things that nurses are naturally doing throughout the day, if those become the triggers, the idea would be that it's more likely to happen. As it turned out, that's actually true. At least in the little project that I did, 84% of the time, patients were turned appropriately within that strategy as compared to 34% of the time under the traditional strategy. There's other things that we implemented as well. There's level 1 evidence that says every single ICU patient should be placed on a pressure relieving surface. You put them on a pressure relieving surface, what an idea, before they develop a hospital acquired pressure ulcer, as opposed to what everybody in the whole world does is wait until they have a hospital acquired pressure ulcer and then put them on a pressure relieving surface. Patients, we had 0 happy rate in our group. So I think that the project was really worthwhile. It was small, and it's definitely a toe in the water, but it definitely did show that a different strategy is more effective, and that you can indeed prevent hospital-acquired pressure ulcers using a different strategy.
That's excellent. So now that you have these results, how do you plan to carry the results forward? Do you have a next step in mind?
Our next step is we've already submitted a proposal for an abstract at the ANA quality meeting to be held in Orlando. We haven't heard. And we have some ideas about certainly doing an article, and maybe something else, i.e. at a Sigma Theta Tau presentation.
Yeah, so you are working on disseminating
Yes.
the results, getting
Yes.
the word out, and then perhaps other advanced practice nurses, DNPs, researchers can take it from there and
Yes.
expand the evidence.
Yes.
That's fabulous. So do you have any advice for the current DNP students on conducting their projects? Do you have any words of wisdom?
Well, my first word is you cannot submit for your IRB approval soon enough. So that's the first thing. I think there's probably a little bit of an issue on the IRB's part with what to do with DNP projects. They're not research, and I think there's it's a little bit cloudy right now, and it takes a long time. So I would just say the sooner the better for the IRB. And then I think be careful about who you select on your committee. I had initially one of my professors, very respected, but she's a researcher, and she was wanting me to do randomization and all kinds of stuff, and I'm like, whoa. That's not evidence-based practice.
Mhm.
So I think you have to get people who understand evidence-based practice on your committee, and then listen to them, because my committee gave me great guidance throughout. My project started out probably pretty good, but it ended up with their guidance. I think it was great the way it turned out. So I would just say listen to your committee.
Excellent, excellent, and keep your eye on the EVP and QI
Right.
Mhm.
focus.
Right.
Very good. Well, Mary, thank you so much for joining us
You're welcome.
today. It's been a privilege to get to talk to you
Thanks.
and learn from all of your years as a quality, not just leader, but an executive, and as now a DNP prepared nurse. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome.